Good evening, and good morning, and good afternoon to all our distinguished participants joining us from across the globe. On behalf of the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I'm honored to welcome you to the fourth episode in our ongoing webinar series called Peace in Myanmar. Today's session, titled Co Creating Justice, Restorative Practices, Truth and Reconciliation, and Decolonization, addresses one of the most difficult yet essential conversation in Myanmar's path to sustainable peace, particularly within the context of Rakhine State. Before I proceed, let me do the treaty recognition. The institute is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the original lands of Metis Nation. We all are treaty people of Treaty 1, and we are all promise bound to work together in the true spirit of reconciliation. Dear audience, as we reflect on the grim legacies of violence, displacement, and deep rooted injustice in Rakhine, the question that confronts us is not only how to end conflict, but how to rebuild a society that is truly just, inclusive, and peaceful. Post conflict societies do not emerge in a vacuum. They are the product of collective choices made about memory, justice, and reconciliation. In Rakhine, where histories of structural exclusion and targeted violence have been compounded by colonial legacies and militarized rule, peace cannot be reduced to the mere absence of war. It must be actively co created through the recognition of past wrongs, the restoration of dignity, and the establishment of mechanisms for dialogue and accountability. This webinar foregrounds three pillars essential to that vision: restorative practices, truth and reconciliation, and decolonization. To guide our thinking, we might turn to the other post conflict societies that have wrestled with similar challenges. For example, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, though not without flaws, helped to publicly document systemic injustices under apartheid while providing conditional amnesty in exchange for truth telling. It left an imperfect yet instructive model for societies transitioning from authoritarian violence to democracy. In Rwanda, following the 1994 genocide, Gaka courts, community based justice mechanisms, were deployed to address the enormous caseloads and to reintegrate perpetrators and survivors within the same communities. These efforts, while criticized for due process limitations, highlighted the importance of community participation in transitional justice. Canada's own Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused on the intergenerational trauma caused by residential schools, placed Indigenous voices at the center of narrative reconstruction, and offered a framework of calls to action that remain critical to ongoing decolonization efforts. The audience. These examples show us that post conflict recovery must go beyond state centric peace agreements. It must include civic reimagining, where survivors, communities, and historically marginalized people have an active voice in shaping the narrative and institutions of the future. In Rakhine, the possibilities for peace will depend on how we reckon with history, how we recognize ethnic and religious plurality, and how we return agency to those whose voice have been silenced. A post conflict Rakhine cannot be built solely through legal agreements or international monitoring. It must emerge from local truths, shared memories, and commitment to redress, reconciliation, and structural transformation. The audience, today's conversation invites us to think not only about justice as punishment, but about justice as healing, participation, and reparation. It is about reimagining Rakhine not just as a post war space, but as a co created community grounded in dignity, trust, and equity. Let us now listen, learn, and reflect together as our distinguished speaker take us through the conceptual, practical, and ethical dimension of this journey. Today, we are deeply express our gratitude in having David Gerald Newman with us, a retired lawyer and a chief advisor of our institute, and 100% volunteer, as he always claims, and he is actually. So, and we also have with us um, uh, Dr. Ernest Thiessen, and he's a core member of our uh, project Peace in Myanmar. And also we have our intern from Masters of Human Rights, Madara Diaz. And with this, dear audience, let me welcome David Newman to start his part of the discussion. And David is going to also briefly share his experience in the field of restorative justice. And I just realized that our advisor Gary Sent is also in the studio. Gary, welcome, and I hope we can start. Thank you, Gary, and we can start our discussion. David, floor is yours. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I wanted to, first of all, confirm that I'm really humbly presenting my own experience as a privileged white person and professional in my territory. I've retired from that, which gives me optimal freedom and independence to speak truth to power without fear and without favor. I also, in my mind, when I was in the legislature, I tried to figure out who was I speaking to when I addressed the speaker in the legislature in the British parliamentary tradition in my province in the country of Canada. And I realized that I was speaking not to the opposition party. I was not speaking to the speaker. I was speaking through the speaker to all of the people of Manitoba, not the ones that voted for me, not the ones that demonstrably supported me only, but everybody in the province of Manitoba, especially given my responsibilities in the province I'll say a bit about. So when I'm speaking, and I also knew that every word I said was being recorded in Hansard in that legislature. So I took it very seriously. And I take it very seriously to have the privilege of speaking to whoever listens to this tonight and whoever listens to the recording of this. Because I'm speaking to each one of you. And I'm speaking to your minds and your hearts and your spirits. And I want you to get to know me a bit, because I want you to know who is speaking in that way to you. You will not be a stranger to me. You'll be a friend I haven't yet met. So I'm an 80-year-old white male Canadian who lives on the ancestral lands of First Nations on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Red River Métis. And interestingly, our city, our province, and our country bears Indigenous names. Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada are all derived from Indigenous languages. I'm a husband, a father, a grandfather. I served as a lawyer for 52 years in private practice, as an advocate and peace builder, fields of labor relations, human rights, environmental law, and Indigenous law. I served for part of this time as a legislator, a cabinet minister, as a servant leader of a large law firm, chair of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, and numerous community organizations, always in my mind in service above self. And since 1983, as a Rotarian, whose motto is service above self, in my decision-making process, I applied the Rotary four-way test in all material decision-making processes. And that test is a self-inquiry used for evaluating what to decide, to think, concentrate your thinking on, and say and do. The test is to ask oneself, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And I'll speak a little later of how broadly I believe all should be defined in our world of one global human family, and having a great need for us to make decisions to take into consideration the impact of all human beings and all nature. My legislator and cabinet minister responsibilities included chairing a review of the civil justice system of Manitoba. In 1995-96, I chaired a report, which is the product of our Court of Appeal judges, our Court of then Queen's Bench, now King's Bench, judges, representatives, lay people, lawyers, and the input from citizens who attended public events where everyone was welcome. So I served as Minister of Energy and Mines, Northern and Native Affairs, and Crown Corporation's Manitoba Hydro and Community Economic Development Funds simultaneously. I served on the Economic Roundtable for Sustainable Development, chaired by the Premier, and on cabinet committees that included the Economic Development Committee, the Sustainable Development Committee, the Land Use and Planning Committee, and the committee that oversaw the Children and Youth Secretariat. When I returned to private practice in October of 1999, after that immersion in the art of the possible world of democratic governance, I became of counsel to the law firm I left to be an elected official. My service in public office transformed me into a global citizen, advocating passionately in service of the oppressed, impoverished, and vulnerable peoples of the world, nature, and future generations. In addition, I served as a negotiator, peace builder, advocate for some major institutions, but often challenging governments at all levels on behalf of change agents trying to build a better world and get justice for more than themselves. As a volunteer, I served as co-chair for the Anglican Diocese of Rupert's Land, Responding in Love campaign to raise funds to compensate survivors of residential schools and create a healing and reconciliation endowment fund. I've served multiple times as an interest and rights arbitrator, but was primarily an advocate. I used the adversarial processes after getting to agreement or restorative justice process failed to provide an agreed result beneficial to all. Why? It is a fair rules-based process and pathway to a court or arbitrator imposed solution after due process and evidence presented, evaluated by independent decision makers, and then a judgment that could be enforceable effectively. But most important, it provides a creative tension that is an inducement to all concerned as parties and stakeholders and communities where they live to come to a settlement agreement. Conciliators and mediators help encourage and support this process. This getting to agreement way to achieve felt justice is depicted on the cover page of the Manitoba 1996 Civil Justice Review Report. It is a circle of diverse people holding hands around a scales of justice on one side and a small circle on the other side. The former represents the adversarial process, the latter represents restorative justice, and any and all alternative dispute resolution means towards the end of justice for all concerned. Not available to me at that time as an advocate and peace builder is the innovative tool created by Canadian Rotarian Dr. Ernest Thiessen, who happens to be on this call tonight. His invention, refined over 30 years, uses augmented intelligence with algorithms, with in-person mediators to help get to agreement using the wonders of technology in a good way for a noble purpose. Smart Settle Infinity can be used for multi-stakeholders, including agents for nature and future generations and children and oppressed, impoverished peoples and vulnerable peoples usually denied a voice in negotiations of peacemaking. And very fortunately, the project Path Towards Peace in Myanmar involves Smart Settle as a tool to provide a way for multi-stakeholders at track 3, track 2, track 1 levels of negotiation, starting with ordinary citizens, concerned citizens, enlightened in the affected territory. And they will then test it out, learn about it, and come to, through a simulation, agreements. And imagine that, of course, moving up to tier 2 level, track 2 level, and then through them with a growing trust in the process from the grassroots up, being adopted by the actual parties involved as governments in the dispute, and others that are allowed to be part of the process. From 2006 to 2009, I served on the Nunavut Planning Commission with Inuit peoples who were developing a land use plan for that vast territory that since 1993, by agreement with the federal government, had become an Inuit self-determining territory on a pathway to becoming a province in the Canadian Federation. And it's very much close to that end destination at this time. Its legislature has no political parties, different from every other jurisdiction in our country. And it sits in circle and makes consensus decisions by, for, and from Nunavut. Since then, I've been a thoughtful observer, student, and advisor as self-determination of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples evolves in the Canadian Confederation, guided by the Supreme Court of Canada, I might say, decisions on important issues of rights, responsibilities, and freedoms for Indigenous peoples, and accountability by governments and businesses that are involved in trying to access Indigenous territories. This came about by virtue of a new major revision to our Constitution, which came into effect in the Constitution Act of 1982. This renewed Constitution of Canada gave all kinds of opportunities for Indigenous peoples, existing treaty rights and other rights to be recognized by our courts and therefore necessarily by our governments and all of those that are seeking to access Indigenous territories. 1982 also ensured that we were fully, the apron strings were fully broken with the United Kingdom, and our relationship there is through the Commonwealth and emotion and culture and best practices, all by our choice, not by requirements. Canada was then fully decolonized in law, albeit not adequately in attitudes and practices. That is something that takes generations to occur, and no one knows that better than the people of Myanmar, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It is the commitment to wise, universal, value-based, continuous improvement, I submit, that is needed. But the empowered Indigenous peoples of Canada, in an inspired resurgence, accelerated in lawful, respectful ways, the recreation of Canada processes towards a multinational country of self-determining parts for the benefit of all. Healing and reconciliation, involving a process of fact gathering and recommendations, was chosen to help inform the general public and motivating and calling to action all peoples and governments and communities and institutions and entities to 6 actions of. And I submit these kinds of 6 actions, calls to action, are applicable to every society in the world. Every society in the world. Learning the truth of the cultural genocide and oppression, and sometimes physical, real killing genocide in some countries, Bangladesh being one. Discrimination of Indigenous peoples and the wrongful harms and denial of equal opportunities inflicted on them. Secondly, acknowledging those wrongs, apologizing for them, paying in kind and financial reparations for them, adopting and implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, working together as equals in mutual respect for mutual interests as agreed. I envisage the ongoing outcome to be the never-ending process of the co-creation of a better Canada for the benefit of all, as a responsible, loving part of the global human family, modeling the shared values of service and the 7 values I now describe. Over the years, I learned that for survival and flourishing of the global human species, my decisions had to give a definition of all in the Rotary 4-way test to require considering as best one can impacts of decisions on everyone, everywhere, the wisdom and goodness of past generations, future generations, and goodness of past generations, of course, sometimes exemplified by the spirit or whatever is passed on orally or in writing from previous generations. And future generations and non-human sentient and non-sentient beings, which I describe as nature. In other words, all of those, I submit, should be considered in making material decisions and what impacts they're going to have. And that's decisions about what you think, what you say, and what you do, especially when you're in positions of responsible power and authority. Now, looking at the world the way I want it to be looked at for the purpose of the further remarks I make, just for a moment, shut your eyes and imagine planet Earth, and you're looking down at it from a satellite. You're looking down at it from the moon. This beautiful blue planet. I don't think we do that often enough. So let me now suggest with that vision of this small planet where we all live on and are in such dire conflicts in, let's look at some of the aspirational commitments that were made immediately after the First World War and the Second World War. So we've adopted as a Western society, Western civilization, an atomic bomb on the peoples of Japan, an indiscriminate killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, children, old people, disabled people. And we've left a lasting impact on the health of generations through radiation poisoning that exists to this day. So and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. Millions of people killed, not indiscriminately, absolutely deliberately, because they were deemed to be inferior. They were deemed to be different. They were deemed to be not worthy of life. So out of that horror came the UN Charter. The UN Charter mandates the UN and its member states to maintain international peace and national security, uphold international law, achieve higher standards of living for their citizens, address economic, social, health, and related problems, and promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. As a charter and constituent treaty, its rules and obligations are binding on all members. Myanmar was a member, is a member. became a member in its different state configurations. Canada is a member, India, Bangladesh, China, and supersede those of other treaties. Chapter 6 describes the Security Council's power to investigate and mediate disputes, the place where smart settle should be utilized. Chapter 7 describes the Security Council's power to authorize economic, diplomatic, and military force to resolve disputes. Chapter 8 makes it possible for regional arrangements to maintain peace and security within their own region. And then we have UNESCO. UNESCO was also a creation in 1945, and the idea for it came in London, England in 1942, and I might say Rotarians were a big part of that, as they saw what was happening in the war, and they knew something had to change. Little did they know the degree of the horrors at that time. So what does the UNESCO do? It states in its preamble, believing in the full and equal opportunities for education for all, in the concentrated pursuit of objective truths, a concentrated pursuit of objective truths. I mean, just think about that and what's happening now. Who's practicing objective truths in some of our nations of the world, who are leaders of it? And in the free exchange of ideas and knowledges are agreed and determined to develop, used to increase the means of communication between their peoples and to employ these means for the purposes of national understanding and a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives. And then, in consequence whereof, it goes on to say, others do hereby create UNESCO, and they put the full United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, for the purpose of advancing through the educational, scientific, and cultural parts of the peoples of the world, the objectives of intergenerational peace and of the common welfare of mankind, for which the United Nations organization was established and which its charter proclaims. So we have the charter, we have UNESCO, which is designed to have education systems in every country of the world advance those goals, educational goals, disseminate truth, how to get along, how to improve the well-being of peoples and understanding amongst peoples. And then we have the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what did the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came into effect on December 10th, 1948, do? I love where it states in the preamble, where it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by rule of law. No accident that Dr. Kaiser Ahmed and the Crick organization and myself have created a project called Rules of Law on Earth Project. And what is the logo for that project? A circle of people holding hands. It's a people system. Scale of justice on one side, small circle on the other side. In other words, the whole world needs what the 1996 report in Manitoba said for Manitoba justice. The whole world needs that now. We need fair rules that are effective and enforceable. And then along comes in 2017 a commitment starting from Canada after they had declined to support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Along came a commitment by Canada to support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was then ratified and embodied in Canadian law, and work is being done to embody its principles in Canadian statutes, federal statutes. So what did that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples say that's relevant? The General Assembly, guided by the purpose and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and good faith in the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by states in accordance with the Charter, that's the UN Charter, affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples while recognizing the rights of all peoples to be different and to be respected as such, affirming also that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And most significantly, affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Article 3 of the UN Declaration. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 6. Every Indigenous person has a right to a nationality. Article 18. Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. Now for a moment, and just think of applying that to the Rohingya in the refugee camps in Bangladesh at this time and how they're treated, let alone how they have been treated in Myanmar. And even think about Rohingya diaspora groups in Rakhine state. So what we have is a common commitment. Every member of the United Nations, a common commitment to all of those aspirational goals. And that can be the basis for a future together, coexistence in harmony with each other and nature. So what I do is provide a checklist. I provide a checklist of what is needed to have a system of rules for the human race at a global level that can, one, address the basic needs and cravings of humans. What are those basic needs and cravings? Some amazingly, universally appealing, approved thought on this comes from the likes of Dr. Viktor Frankl and Paul K. Chappell and many thought leaders around the world. Purpose and meaning, a basic craving. Belonging, a desire to belong. Psychologists might call it a need for attachment, a need for self-worth, a basic craving for self-worth, being valued, being empowered, being respected, having worldviews appreciated, understood, respected. Respect, justice, authenticity. I mean, how often is hypocrisy something that is deeply upsetting, especially to young people, when they hear adults preach something and then they conduct themselves contrary to that and they expect more from their children. And then, of course, food, clothing, shelter. But what Paul K. Chappell did was turn upside down Maslow's hierarchy of needs and put purpose and meaning and belonging and so forth above that, because those are more important sometimes than those, and we overemphasize sometimes those material things ahead of the basic things that are cravings. Values to consider, the second item on the checklist. Consider values to survive as a species, a global species. Not a clan or a tribe or just a family, and not just a nation state, peoples. And what are those values to consider to survive as a species? Well, the indigenous peoples have taught me that a decision to love everyone in nature is a good starting point. Truth is a value which is essential. Even the United Nations Charter agrees with that. Honesty, wisdom, courage, respect, humility, the seven sacred teachings, or the grandfather teachings of the indigenous people, certainly of Canada and North America, but I believe generally accepted of peoples around the world as pretty sound moral principles. Thirdly, checklist. Consider how attitudes, governance, institutions, systems, policies, and laws based on an understanding of these needs and cravings, and how one can, in a practical way, consider addressing those needs and cravings. In other words, you apply those values within yourself, within your family, within your community, and then within the governance systems at local, regional, national, and international levels. Concepts like positive peace have, in the Rotary world, Steve Killalay, the founder of the Global Peace Institute and the head of Institute for Economics and Peace, said there are 8 factors for positive peace. Johan Galtung gave it an academic meaning, which is equally applicable and more expansive, but Killalay's definition gives a practical, measurable definition that anyone can understand and makes perfect sense. And there's 8 pillars to positive peace: well-functioning government, sound business environment, equitable distribution of resources, acceptance of the rights of others, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, high levels of human capital, low levels of corruption. Not a bad checklist for any process co-creating a new government at any level. Fourth in the checklist: knowledge, skills, practices, habits, and behavior needed for humans as a society and a species to coexist sustainably and resolve disputes justly by agreement without violence. Paul K. Chappell called it peace literacy. In other words, skills for the benefit of all and harmonious coexistence. he always uses a wonderful analogy of imagine sending students from a school who had never played basketball out in a basketball court and expect them to play the game of basketball. Imagine a group of students that had never played a musical instrument before being sent out to perform a symphonic piece of music. It would be a mess. So, question is, why is peace literacy not taught in schools with at least the importance of reading, writing, arithmetic, sports, arts, and computers? Something to think about. Where do you want a society to start? 5, checklist. Guide for individual decision making about what to consider before deciding what to think and say and do. Of course, I'm suggesting the 4-way test, which I explained earlier. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? With all for human survival and equal opportunity to flourish, defined broadly to include everyone, everywhere, the wisdom and goodness of past generations, future generations, and non-human, sentient, non-sentient beings. For those that have faith backgrounds, the golden rule is one way of describing the ethics of reciprocity. Treat others as you wish to be treated. Another kind of thing to consider in the checklist. The common commandment for people of faith, of many enduring universal religions, to love one's neighbor. But how do we define neighbor? For human race survival and equal opportunity to flourish, define neighbor as broadly as all is, I submit, should be in the Rotary 4-way test. Checklist number 6. Universally embrace and practice the concept that means justify ends. Ends do not justify means. In other words, decisions about means to be used to cause outcomes must be in alignment with, not contrary to the moral or utopian outcomes intended. And you'll find that in all of the writings, a theme in Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and certainly it's even embodied, I believe, in the due process of law, in the legal process. Rules of law and rules of games and sports and just organizations, impartial adjudication, and effective enforcement, remedies and means of reparation, restoration, healing, and rectification must be all part of that consideration in the checklist. And that's why we created Rules of Law on Earth project through the Conflict Research and Resilience and Research Institute Canada. Now, I'll conclude my personal part of this with a story. And again, this is just a story from a privileged white guy from Canada who happened to be in positions of responsibility and power. And clearly, of course, I was always part of the establishment. But I was never suppressed, self-suppressed by establishment thinking. I was there to serve everybody and to change institutions to benefit everybody and to cause governments to benefit everybody. So Canadian Confederation, by a constitution to be basis of peace, order, and good government, was created out of British and French colonized lands in 1867 by founding fathers. Interesting that we have founding fathers, and too bad we didn't have, and now we can have, founding mothers, founding children, founding agents for nature, right? I mean, we have to keep up with the times, right? We have to keep up with the times. Manitoba added in the center of Canada, as it was added in the center of Canada in 1870, as a Canadian land and water base expanded from east to west. Canada was expanding really through railway development and others, really to protect its sovereignty and ensure that everyone could be part of one great land from coast to coast to coast. Indigenous peoples, demonized as primitives, heathens, and savages, were identified by government and settlers from other lands and businesses and local and provincial and federal governments to be in the way of development. So treaties were negotiated unfairly and then broken by the colonizers, and laws and policies were created to move them out of the way into marginalized, segregated communities and convert them into Christians and replace their languages, cultures, values, worldviews, purpose and meaning, belonging, self-worth, respect, wisdom, ways of life, faiths and livelihoods, and governance, and economic and social and legal systems with imposed European ones. And we Canadians, when we became a country in 1867, did that as well. We did that as well. 1929-30, natural resources transferred by federal government to the province of Manitoba. And this was done equivalent. Right now it'll be a big issue in Alberta if Alberta considers separation. The First Nations people and Métis people won't want that to happen. So the Crown lands became provincial jurisdiction, and Indians, and now called First Nations peoples, were and still are under the Indian Act in what is correctly called an apartheid system. But right now the Indigenous peoples don't want to relinquish it because they're taking full advantage of the taxation advantages, immunity from seizure, and other aspects of it. But meanwhile, they're doing all kinds of self-determining work to escape any suppression through that kind of legislation. The Northern Affairs Act 1970 replaced a commissioner for the vast, lowly populated, resource-rich north of Manitoba, about 80% of the province, with a Minister of Northern Affairs serving in the Manitoba government cabinet. And that, of course, turned out to be me in 1995. After I was elected for a Winnipeg constituency called Riel in 1995 and chaired a review of the civil justice system of Manitoba, I became concurrently Minister of Northern and Native Affairs, Minister of Energy Mines, two Crown corporations, Manitoba Hydro and Community Economic Development Fund, and Deputy House Leader. On reviewing the Northern Affairs Act, I learned that none of over 50 local communities intended to become municipal incorporated semi-autonomous elected local governments within 5 years had become incorporated. In other words, the intent of the legislation had not been realized 25 years later. Actually, 27 years later when I became the minister. Also, I noted all had become dependent on the provincial government. That is, all of the northern communities had become dependent on the provincial government and had not been empowered to be effective local governments. They were on Crown lands and subject to Crown land policies, and therefore subject to the power and control and decisions of the provincial government. Almost all funding came from the province and decisions about how it was spent. So I did two things. One, I directed my deputy minister to lead facilitated strategic planning process with all civil servants to co-create their vision of a way forward to implement the intent of and means to transition into semi-autonomous, like all other municipalities, local governments, but remaining under the Northern Affairs Act. After 2 years in 1999, a final plan called the Self-Reliance Initiative was approved. Funding was provided by the Treasury Board, and the first local government was incorporated after 27 years. When I attended what I thought would be a celebration with all the civil servants for their achievement, I was met by a room full of sad and subdued people. I sat deliberately for the longest serving female in the department, there since 1970. I asked what was wrong. She said bereavement and fear. I asked her to explain. She said sadness because they realized in the planning process that they had been doing things for people in the community, not empowering them to do things for themselves. With that realization, they were fearful that they would now lose their jobs because it would no longer be needed, as their work would be now done by the local incorporated governments. I told her, and then everyone in the room, they had now become the most valuable civil servants in government because they had learned how to empower others to help themselves and become more self-reliant, able to thrive as their community chose. And they could build the capacity to achieve. That is the human capital I described earlier, the capacity to achieve in their own local, chosen, culturally appropriate ways. I said their new role in the provincial government was to advocate within all departments of government for local government's needs and ambitions and for obstacles to self-reliance to be addressed for the benefit of all. I further said that as such, they had more job security than ever before, and I would get from Treasury Board long-term support for the self-reliance initiative to ensure its continuation. When I left elected office in October of 1979, I knew that the blueprint for change the civil servants created was going to continue. It did, and still does 25 years later. It takes time. Cultures of multi-generational oppression, discrimination, and trauma and dependency are challenging to overcome. Also, the natural human resistance to change has to be addressed with inducements, encouragement, and visible positive outcomes for which they were recognized. The fact is that almost all of the members of these communities were Indigenous peoples, often adjacent to First Nations reserves under the federal government jurisdiction, and an Indian Act that has created a multi-generational dependency of First Nations peoples traumatized by residential schools and imposed ways of the federal government. The lesson I share this for the benefit of the Myanmar project is that the political leadership of Myanmar can do better for its ethnic populations and Rohingya and other unwelcome stateless people forced to live outside Myanmar than what Canada and Manitoba have done for Indigenous peoples. By addressing needs, aspirations, and desires of the ethnic groups striving for self-determination, a multi-shared nation federation can be nurtured, and the synergy of empowered peoples guided by the checklist above can be unleashed for the benefit of all. Canada and Manitoba and other provinces are on the right path for our evolving federation by supporting Truth and Reconciliation, 94 calls to action, and UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the recommendation of rights of missing murdered Indigenous women. Also, since Constitution Act 1962, legislation has been passed, modern day self-government treaties entered into, hundreds of court cases recognizing Indigenous constitutional and treaty and agreement rights have been decided in their favor. The outcomes are benefiting Indigenous peoples and providing reparation and justice for the wrongs inflicted, including cultural genocide, treaty violations, human rights discrimination. The arc of justice, healing, and reconciliation is bending in the right direction. This is beneficial to all. A pathway without violence towards justice for Indigenous peoples and multiple self-determined nations within the ever-changing Federation of Canada is evolving for the benefit of the broadly defined all and the survival of the human species, and for equal opportunity to flourish sustainably in positive peace and in harmony with nature. Canada can learn a great deal from how Myanmar addresses its challenges in its unique circumstances and with its unique history. This presentation is intended to share what I have learned during my long and privileged life about leadership and what has worked for me in my service as a global citizen in and from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada. We are one global human family. To survive and thrive as a species, we must help each other and find ways to resolve conflicts without violence, achieve sustainability, and restoratively. You have my best wishes in your endeavor in another part of the world, which I hope to learn a lot more about, and I'm there to help in any way I possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for such a wonderful sharing your insights and your experience. And we have listened to you quite intently. The audience will move to Q&A session. And first, I would like to welcome our advisor Gary Senft to say a few words about the project and, in general, the theme itself, reconciliation and post-colonial societies. And of course, Dr. Ernest, please chime in whenever you want. Gary, let's welcome you first. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Kazra and David. Thank you for that presentation. And, as Kauser was mentioning, I think we all listened intently, and it's a fairly complex processes that you've described, but you described them very eloquently and a bit thematically, so we can walk through them. And hopefully this recording can be used to help people reflect back and go a little deeper onto some of the subject matters. But one of the things that you bring to my mind is that values are important in the process, and are the foundations laid there? So I just comment on the value system, and also when we look at where we're at today, you've set out a picture, a map of how you might get somewhere. But can you comment a little bit just about the times that we're in, where when you mentioned truth as a very important element, we seem to be in a bit of a complex state. So how do we give hope going forward? If I could, thank you.
Well, interestingly, just before the most recent federal election in the States, the UNESCO really partnering with what it was called the Global Campaign for Peace Education, updated the 1974 curricula for peace education in school systems around the world. And you think about it, that's 1974. That's like 50 years ago, right? From 2023. But the UNESCO member countries in 2023, by consensus, approved changed curricula. And that curricula being endorsed not only by UNESCO in countries in that way, representatives in that way, was also supported by the Global Campaign for Peace Education based in the United States of America. And leading up to that, the United States, who had been suspended from UNESCO because they stopped supporting it financially, restored their funding and got their membership restored. So my own belief is that there's two, from the top down, UNESCO is the vehicle. UNESCO is the vehicle from the top. Rotary even has representatives, for example, in the United Nations as civil society representatives. They don't have any power, they don't have any votes, but they've got a lot of influence, right? So you've got UNESCO, which really has the responsibility, and the member countries have the responsibility, as the preamble indicated previously, to implement those kinds of things in the education systems. But the real hard work is implementation, right? They can tell the governments that, and they'll get resistance, and they'll say, no, when we're sovereign, we can do what we want. So where the real work can be done, and that's why I wanted to do it on a checklist basis, is you do it from the grassroots up. And you know where it starts? It starts within a classroom in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, where you got refugee students, and they can be of any ages, and they can be girls and women and young boys and men. But imagine them receiving that kind of not only basic values education, but basic skills to hold meaningful jobs, right? And all of the attributes of character and so forth that are necessary to, with self-worth, be good workers and entrepreneurs and based on values. So, and that's the most difficult kind of place. But what if you do it in the villages, in rural and in the cities, and you through civil society and enlightened business and professional and service clubs and faith groups. You encourage this because you know it's fundamental to the future of humanity. And I'm really strong on bringing it. I know Gary really understands through the Charter for Compassion how faith groups can work together in the Parliament of World Religions. It's the numbers of people that are involved in faith groups around the world looking for compassionate action. And what better way to start than value-based education? I mean, kids used to get it within their faith systems, right? Or they get it from parents. When parents were home enough and took the time enough, and social media didn't get in the way of them educating their own children, right? So I think faith groups can be a huge part of this. And of course, whether it's Buddhist or Muslim or Christian, whatever it is, faith groups have that fundamental responsibility. And again, go back to love thy neighbor, right? Neighbor doesn't mean just people outside your own community or outside your own country. It's people within your own village, within your own local school, right? I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. Ernest, if you have any questions for David, unmute. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, you're right. You're good.
Did you help me there? Okay. So thank you, David, for that encouraging message. And that really sets the groundwork for the project that we have ahead of us in Myanmar.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ernest.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the 1 hour mark. As a standard, we do practice closing the session by 1 hour. However, before I close, I have received an interesting comment from AEM Mumtaz Hussain, and I'm just flashing his comment in the screen. And he wrote, the Arakan army is equally oppressive with the Rohingyas in Rakhine, just like the junta regime. How the world may view this indifference of convenience, and what may be the way out. So this is one of the comments we have received from
well, I'd love to take that, because that is exactly the kind of thing that the people in the region, and ideally, of course, in Myanmar itself, would engage in talking about as part of the kinds of actions and conduct which the smart settle process would be used for. So wouldn't it be wonderful to have, if it's just a simulation, an American army voice, right, in the simulation, and really, if it's an educated citizen of goodwill that wants to practice the kinds of aspiring human rights and responsibilities that I've described in the different documents, UN documents, then the kinds of the reasoning behind that oppression are then articulated, right? I mean, there's always going to be reasons, but in that process will be the voices for the Rohingyas, right? Will be voices for women, will be voices for children, right? Will be voices of well-meaning people of religious values, of the kind that are universal, and that I described, the most fundamental one being love thy neighbor, right? So how does that all work out? So once you get explanations on the table, I did countless negotiations in my career. And once you get reasons on the table, or in litigation, once you get reasons for a judgment or reasons for a tribunal decision or reasons in a negotiation for a position, then you can talk, right? You have something to address. And if the common objective is something better than the way things are right now, then you got a motivation, right? But you have to build trust. So the critical thing is to demonstrate in a respectful dialogue, we call a negotiation using Smart Settle. The first thing you do is you bring people in who are prepared to engage in good faith and reasonably in a process of negotiation where reasons are given and the dialogue begins. And once you have that trust and once you have those relationships and you say, yeah, this could contribute something and we could come up with potentially a consensus. And if AI can, using public data or data that's involved, generate even improvements in what we agree to, sounds like a pretty good use of time. So I really encourage people to learn about Smart Settle and learn about the kind of process that this project is proposing to begin this relationship building and achieving a simulated outcome, which can then be moved up to the next level and ultimately up to the solution, permanent solution, sustainable solution at the government level.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Yeah.
I should just mention on that point that the team here has been working together with the assistance of AI to model the preferences of the various stakeholders in Myanmar. And we have some preliminary results of that simulation that show that indeed, if these parties are able to work together and collaborate and you give them a way out, that indeed they can find a place that's better than where they are now for all of the stakeholders. So we're in the process now of revising that and improving that. And the proposal is to do many iterations as we get closer and closer, moving from track 3 to track 2 to finally to track 1.
Thank you, Ernest. I think, and I just would like to add 2 cents from my side is that you are very right, Mr. Mumtaz. Rohingyas were used as a pawn from both the sides, Myanmar junta and now Arakan army. We have received reports of ongoing violence in Butidong and Ratudong areas, and Rohingyas were forcibly displaced. And I think over the past 2 months, 140,000 Rohingyas fled the northern part and took refuge. And I think one of the ways we are trying to visualize peace in Myanmar is to bring these stakeholders in a common platform of understanding the win-win situation that they would enjoy if they agree for the ceasefire and the perpetual peace. And you have heard our speakers today, building trust is important. And it is the responsibility of all the communities in Myanmar to work towards the peace. And what we are trying to see through the Smart Settle Infinity solution is to understand what we can offer for all the parties so that all of them understand the peace dividend. The requirement of peace is enormous because nobody gains anything out of conflict. And this is something we are going to we are working on it, as you understand. And beside the smart settle use for e-negotiation, we are also working on a whole concept. We call it a mini Marshall Plan. And through pumping funds and reconstruct Rakhine, we are going to possibly convince everyone in this area that Rohingyas are just one of the stakeholders and victim of the conflict. And if they are taken back, if they are given the safety and dignity of and their rights, they are actually going to contribute more towards the betterment of the state itself. The audience, we are going to end here. And please follow us in our social media platforms. And if you would like to draw more lessons from today's webinar, you will find this one streamed in our YouTube channel. Please do subscribe. And Peace in Myanmar project is ongoing, and we are going to arrange further webinars down the road. So please keep an eye in our social media feeds, and we'll announce our speakers and the topics. And before we end, we would like to say a few words with regards to Rohingyas. Rohingyas are one of the most persecuted ethnic minority groups in the world, as we all know. And we don't have much options, actually, whether it is a project that we are running or as a global citizen, as we have heard from David Newman. We ought to understand that Rohingyas need a place to go. They cannot just remain as stateless forever. Bangladesh has done quite, I would say, generous job of hosting them, but it is also getting to a point that Bangladesh and other host countries are getting a little impatient hosting them because nobody wants a protracted conflict right at their doorsteps. With this little bit of note, let me also say good night to all of you. Stay well and stay safe, and let's bring peace in the world once again. Thank you. Bye bye.